Hello everyone and welcome once again to Killershrewfan's 12 Days of Reviews. And today we'll be taking a look at the final W Dragon figure in my collection that I have yet to feature on the channel. I'm talking of course about this, the W Dragon Allosaurus. This repaint of their original Allosaurus sculpt released in the spring months of 2019 and hails from a time before they took up the Jurassic license. It was a model that always had a lot of appeal to me, but for one reason or another I only just got around to picking it up around this time last year. And since it will probably be a while before I get my hands on another W Dragon piece, I figured why not tide us all over with a long overdue review of this guy and decide if that same appeal still holds up nearly 4 years later. So let's get into it. It's Killershrewfan's 12 Days of Reviews, and this is the W Dragon Allosaurus. As per usual, we'll start by talking about the sculpt, and where better than the head. Now the real attention getter here is easily those striking lacrimal crests above the orange eyes. Not only are they built up with a generous amount of keratin, but the red coloration really helps draw your eye and could be suggestive of a sexual display of some sort. The rest of the detail on the head is also quite pleasing, with a mix of smaller scales across the face and clusters of larger scales running across the mandible. The fixed jaw is sculpted in an open position, showcasing the wide tongue and glossy tissue of the pseudo-cheeks, as well as all of those individually sculpted pointed teeth of varying sizes. Those are quite lovely. So overall, the detail on the head is quite nice, but as far as an accurate Allosaurus skull goes, it fares a bit worse. For one thing, the muzzle feels a bit too pointed, while the curvature of the maxilla is too pronounced in relation to the premaxilla. That and the keratinous ridge behind the eyes seems to run at an odd angle, not at all in line with what we see in the skull of Allosaurus. The overall effect is a skull with jugulars too pronounced to be Jamatsoni, and a snout that feels too pointed to be Fragilis or Europaeus. And that's before we even mention the bizarre way the keratin rims the skull. Instead, what we're left with is a mishmash of features that make for a cool design, no question, but less so for a scientific one. This is one case, however, where I can certainly accept that for what it is, just a cool looking dinosaur head. Moving on to the neck, you can see this area of the animal has been adorned in overlapping plate scales sprinkled with a dual row of osteoderms, and I appreciate how this detail feels more tightly packed in the curve of the neck while being stretched tighter over the swell of the opposite side. The main texture past the head is one of a leathery hide, and augmented with great areas of sagging skin and creases in the flesh, most notably hanging down beneath the open mouth and above the pectorals, as well as around the gut and at the base of the tail. The arms of this Allosaurus are long and powerful, with palms held correctly facing inwards to expose the plated scales that run across the backs of the fingers. But despite getting the positioning of the hands correct, it seems they forgot one of the most iconic features of Allosaurus, that being the enlarged claw on the first digit. Here, all of the gray claws appear to be more or less the same length and shape, and that omission is a bit disappointing, I must say. The legs are quite well muscled, and in their active state you can see all of the tensing cords of muscles in the thighs and calves as you feed down the sturdy ankles into the feet. Once again, you have got these scoots included running up the backs of the digits, and I will say, I love the movement of these toes. You can see how they're splayed out beneath the planted foot while being slightly curled up with the lift of the opposite leg, and I do appreciate all of the details on the sole there. Beyond that, there's some great muscling going on at the base of the tail, and you can see how the striations and wrinkles continue all the way down its undulating form. And speaking of the undulation, one of the best parts of this piece is how the Allosaurus has been sculpted in such a dynamic pose. Being rendered in mid-sprint, head craning to the left as the mouth gapes open as if chasing down a prey item. And the subtle lean to it helps to emphasize that hurried movement. It may not be super realistic. There might be something off about the gait, or the curling up tail might be a bit too flexible, but I think in this case, such an active pose does go well with such a stylized looking sculpt. Of course, with such an active pose, you're going to need some support, and to that end, this Allosaurus comes with a small base done with a rocky or perhaps muddy texture and paint. If it is actually rock, a foot indentation feels like a bit of an odd feature, but regardless, it more than does the trick. The Allosaurus slots perfectly onto its pedestal and is incredibly sturdy when on display. After having it for a year now, I haven't had any issues with it toppling over or even leaning on that base. I think Nanmu needs to take note on how W Dragon executed this pose if they want to keep doing their dynamic one-footed poses. As far as the paint job goes, it's primarily gray tones with a tan underbelly, with the slightest hints of a warm wash across the details on the underside. Meanwhile, the lateral and dorsal regions boast a light dry brushing to bring out all the wrinkles and folds of skin in that leathery hide. It's pretty straightforward in both its design and application, but the real area of visual interest outside the lacrimals, and what actually made this repaint catch my eye more than the original, lies in the tan striping that runs down the length of the body. The underside of the tail is even banded in gray stripes, all of which come together to create an eye-catching but sensible color scheme for a large predator. I will also say that the paint is finished in a semi-waxy sheen, while the markings are applied thinly enough to give the illusion of subcutaneous pigmentation. All of which is key to me for selling a realistic paint job. All in all, it's one cool deco. As for the size of this figure, it measures in at just over 12 inches or about 30 centimeters long, and for an animal that was estimated to be between 28 to 32 feet long, that would put this animal somewhere in the 128 to 132 scale range. Getting into some comparisons, we'll start by bringing in some other Allosaurus figures. First up, we have Nanmu's Allosaurus Blade. You can see this is another case of Nanmu's pose having similar ideas to another figure, but which one you prefer overall will depend greatly on your tastes. Personally, I prefer the W Dragon offering, but there are some things that Nanmu does surprisingly better in the accuracy department. Next we have PNSO's Allosaurus Paul. Now, as far as an accurate model goes, this is an objectively better take on Allosaurus from an accuracy standpoint, and I don't doubt for many that it's one of the go-to models out there in this regard. If anything though, it helps us to highlight the deviations in W Dragon's head sculpt. And now for some W Dragon comparisons. First up we have their very gnarly looking Giganotosaurus, another cool stylized figure from their non-Jurassic lineup, although it does have some visual nods to the design of Dino Crisis. Oh man, what I wouldn't give to have had this be the design we got in Dominion. That would have been a change for the better to me. And speaking of Jurassic, here is the Allosaurus with their Spinosaurus, which is of course based on the JP3 design. Good model, but not my favorite take on that particular movie monster. And finally, we have W Dragon's unmatched Giraffatitan, which I actually looked at as part of last year's 12 days of reviews. This is still easily my favorite piece from them, and I will say these two play off of each other quite well. It almost looks like the Allosaurus has flushed a smaller individual from the herd and is looking for a chance to bring it down. And I can see these two being used for some cool dinosaur toy photography. And like T-Rex and Triceratops, what would an Allosaurus review be without its nemesis, the Stegosaurus? Here it is with Bieber the Stegosaurus by PNSO. This isn't in scale, of course. I think one of Rebor's Stegos would fare a bit better in this department, but it still makes for a classic image of predator and prey nonetheless. And that was W Dragon's Allosaurus model, and overall, it is certainly a cool figure with a lot of presence and attitude given the dynamic pose and appealing color scheme. Even with its faults, it's my personal favorite quote-unquote Allosaurus in my collection, but if accuracy is the name of the game for you, then this isn't the Allosaurus you're looking for. But if you're someone like me who can appreciate it purely on its artistic merit, aesthetics, and overall quote-unquote cool factor, then it might be worth tracking down, especially if you're interested in W Dragon's work before their transition to licensed Jurassic statues and other more stylized works. It might not be as good as their Giraffa Titan, but I still dig it. As always though, I want to know what you guys think of this figure. Do you own it? Are you planning to track one down? What is your favorite W Dragon piece and why? Drop a comment down below, and as always, thank you so much for tuning in to today's review. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again tomorrow for a trip back to the Namek Formation. Until then, take care out there, and bye-bye.